Hello, I'm Sondra Gilman, Chairman of the American Theatre Wing, with our board president, Doug Leeds. Welcome to today's program, where we will be covering commercial theater off-Broadway.
We'll be back later to tell you more about the work of the American Theatre Wing. But right now, please join us for another edition of Working in the Theatre.
It's nice to remember, although you know the snow will follow. Deep in December, it's nice.
You're watching The Great Standard, Try to Remember, from the new Off-Broadway production of the record-setting musical, The Fantastics. The 42-year run of that show's original production was a unique theatrical achievement. These days, it's hard and rare for a commercial off-Broadway production to sustain any kind of run. I'm Howard Sherman, Executive Director of the American Theatre Wing. Today, we're going to explore the state of commercial off-Broadway to find out whether it's healthy, sluggish, or, as some have suggested, in crisis. With us today are Marc Routh, producer of the new production of The Fantastics and president of the League of Off-Broadway Theaters and Producers; Ken Davenport, producer of the current off-Broadway hit Altar Boys, and creator, producer, and director of the awesome 80s Prom; Nancy Nagel Gibbs, producer of Bat Boy the Musical and Fully Committed, and general manager of the Vagina Monologues and I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change; and Alan Schuster, a partner in the new off-Broadway complex 37 Arts and producer of Marvin's Room, Oleana, and Jeffrey. If we read the trade publications and periodically the New York Times, people want to suggest that off-Broadway is in trouble. Marc, I'm going to start with you as the president of the league and just say, are there problems?
I think there are problems. The economics are certainly challenged at this point. On the other hand, you know, everybody is always signaling the death knell for off-Broadway, for Broadway, for the musical. You know, we hear how we're always in trouble, and that's why I think, you know, theater is called the imaginary invalid, or the, you know, the ever much maligned theater. The fabulous invalid. That's it. But the thing is that what off-Broadway is always changing, and I think we go through cycles. There are cycles of Broadway too, you know, where all of a sudden things seem to be working economically. I think that we're probably on the cusp of the pendulum swinging the other way and off-Broadway starting to work again, because I think some of the things that are happening in the Broadway theater are going to affect that. The shows are running longer. It's much harder to get a theater. The musicals have to be done in the straight playhouses, so it's very likely that, therefore, straight plays that would have done on Broadway are going to start to be done off-Broadway once again, which, as I've always thought, that's one of the best places to watch a play as opposed to a musical, because of the intimacy and how wonderful that experience is.
Alan, you've been part of this scene since the 70s. Do you agree with Marc's assessment?
Well, generally I agree with Marc's assessment. I mean, you know, having been in this business for so long, I've seen every cycle come and go. And you know, the New York Times will cycle one year in the dire strait of off-Broadway, and then a year and a half later we'll have an article about how great off-Broadway is. So this is neither the worst of times nor the best of times. I've certainly seen several other periods in which it has been far worse. When I started in the mid-'70s, 2/3 of the off-Broadway theaters were dark. In 1988, half the off-Broadway theaters were dark. We're nowhere near that situation now. Now we have a slight oversupply in new theaters. So, you know, we normally have 1 or 1.5 hits per year off-Broadway. I mean, let's remember that in the theater world at large, only 1 out of 10 shows succeed. So on that basis, it takes a while to fill new theaters. We've had, over the last 3 years, 12 new theaters come onto the off-Broadway scene. We've now, in the last year, had 8 go away. So we're starting to move towards equilibrium. Once we reach that equilibrium, I think we're, as Marc says, we're on the cusp of the cycle turning the other direction. I do want to correct one thing that was said in the introduction. there are a lot of shows running for a long time off-Broadway. Marc and I are involved in Stomp. It's been running 12 3/4 years now. Nancy, I Love You, Perfect Not Change has been running a long time.
10.
Blue Man has been running for 14 years. Altar Boys has been running for
a year and a half now.
Well, Altar Boys certainly, and I wasn't suggesting that there aren't those long-established hits, but Altar Boys is certainly the newest show, one of the new shows, which seems to have got itself a good foothold. And again, listening to what people say in the press, those are harder to come by. It's not necessarily the case. In terms of establishing Altar Boys,
But they've always been hard to come by.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been very fortunate in my career. I worked on the original Little Shop of Horrors. Alan and I worked on it together off-Broadway in the early 80s. That ran for 5 years, which was quite a phenomenon at the time. Nonsense was running at that time. That was a long-running show. I also have been very fortunate to work on De La Guarda, which ran for about 6 years and falls into the model of Stomp and Blue Man, in that they're event shows in a way. They're not as necessarily union burdened, and not that the union burden is necessarily a bad thing, but when the show is not burdened with the unions, there sometimes is a freedom to do things that you may not be able to do. But they're event driven, and they're great shows to bring kids to, they're great shows to bring young people to. So there have always been long-running shows, and there have always been a lot of shows that open and close.
is the event-driven model proving to be more prevalent now than it might have been?
I'll address that. I mean, what's interesting about what Alan said is absolutely there are a lot of long-running shows, but if you listen to the list, it's Stomp, it's Blue Man, it's The Awesome 80s Prom, which is in its 3rd year, Tony and Tina's Wedding, which is in its 18th year or something unbelievable. Even I would say, I Love You, You're Perfect is not, it's the what worries me about the state of off-Broadway, while I'm an eternal optimist, is the traditional musical or the traditional play is having difficulty getting a foothold. Even Altar Boys, which is, I say to people all the time, and I actually did it in a lot of my negotiations with vendors and everyone, I said, you know what, you name me the last off-Broadway book musical that recouped its investment in this period of time, and I'll pay you whatever you want. I'll pay you double, because no one can do it. I mean, Altar Boys has been running for a year and a half. The last musical to run that long is I Love You, You're Perfect. It's 10 years ago. Look at that theatrical index. There are no other musicals running in between 10 years and a year and a half, more traditional.
Ken, are there any shows that you can think of that have opened and closed that should still be running, that have a sufficient quality to merit the audiences?
I hate that argument, Alan. That if they're good enough, they'll bubble up. I don't know if that's always true. I think there's some validity to that, but we're all very biased and very passionate about the shows that we do, and I do think that Off-Broadway has lost its ability to do the Little Shop of Horrors of today. Little Shop of Horrors had, I believe, 15 equity members and relatively simple physical production compared to what we're doing today. Bat Boy was on that model. I did Bat Boy in 2001. Bat Boy, we just squeaked out where the figures were. In August of 2001, it was like, we are home free, all we have to do is get through September, and we're running, because we had built, it'd taken us 6 months to build, which is what it takes an off-Broadway show to build, is at least used to take 3 months, now it takes 6 months to build an audience. So it's very difficult to sustain your costs for that long. So we are losing that niche, and so then when Avenue Q comes along, they didn't move it to off-Broadway, they moved it to Broadway. When Spelling Bee came along, we moved it to Broadway, because once it had its reviews and its audience, it's like, we need to be able to sell this out on the weekends, and the weekdays don't matter.
And we're even seeing shows that were very successful off-Broadway shows a generation ago. You mentioned Little Shop of Horrors, I'll also mention Steel Magnolias, that when they're revived are not coming back to off-Broadway, they're going to Broadway. Is that purely a byproduct of costs? Or can you not produce those shows off-Broadway?
Sorry, no.
I think a lot of that has to do with the marketing attention, the advertising attention that you can get. I mean, it's one of those situations. We struggle for that. We opened in March of '05. And to try and get someone to pay attention to an off-Broadway show when everyone's gearing up for the Tony Awards and that marketing machine, it's very difficult. So a lot of it's just much easier. Listen, people come into town and they say, I had a group the other day in the lobby of Altar Boys they were about to buy. And suddenly they said, oh, it's off-Broadway? We had to walk a long way to get to this theater. Now, we're actually pretty close. New World Stadium is close. We're from Ireland. We want to go see a Broadway show. And it was, well, why don't you see this show? You can't even see this. We'd rather go see The Lion King. The interesting thing is The Lion King is playing much closer to Ireland than Altar Boys will ever play, probably. But they had this idea in their head that they wanted to see something Broadway related.
Marc, you wanted to respond to the question about revivals. Certainly you were involved in Little Shop going to Broadway.
Well, I actually worked as the press assistant, which is when I first met Nancy on the original Little Shop, and then I produced the revival. And I have produced a number of shows that would fall into the category of small musicals. Smokey Joe's Cafe is a show that we originally, when we first thought of the idea, thought it might play in an off-Broadway theater. And when it finally came to producing it, we felt not only did it have to be in a Broadway theater, but it had to be in a Broadway theater of a certain size because of what we were ultimately trying to do. Little Shop is a huge anomaly. It's when you talk about there hasn't been a show since Little Shop. Little Shop is the only off-Broadway show that I know of that's a traditional book musical. The other successful musicals, if you look at the canon of off-Broadway shows, are Nonsense, Forever Plaid,
I Love You.
I Love You, and and those are the musicals that I know that recouped and made a significant profit. There are a few others. I think Hedwig recouped, but it didn't run a particularly long time, and wasn't a huge moneymaker. It had a very significant run, but there are very, very few musicals, and I think that they're all. We refer to them in our office as sort of that fish that somehow manages to exist at the bottom of the Hudson River. It sort of has morphed into some strange being to actually live and breathe and succeed. And that's, so I think the off-Broadway musical specifically is a very amorphous thing. And we've tried quite a few times. I mean, I produced Das Barbecue with Alan, Inside Out, Song of Singapore, a show that I loved and was very proud of, and it ultimately didn't work. And I think that there is something about the economics of off-Broadway musicals specifically that makes it very, very difficult.
Well, the event shows, as Nancy called them, the Stunts, the Blue Man, the De La Guardas, are as close to musicals as you can get without having traditional book or traditional lyrics. And in many ways, they've replaced the off-Broadway musicals of my youth, the Little Mary Sunshines and Your Own Things, and those shows which had good runs. But let's define what a good run was then and what a good run is now. In those days, if a show ran a year, that was a tremendous run. If it ran a year and a half, it was fantastic. If it ran 2 years, unbelievable. Fantastics is an anomaly. But now we expect hit shows to run 5 years.
And is that because we look at the Broadway model and feel that off-Broadway has to measure up to the same situation?
No, I don't think it's necessarily the Broadway model. It is the model of the world, in terms of establishing a brand and the brand having identification with the public and being able to, for want of a better word, exploit that brand over a longer period of time. Because once you establish its identity, the identity takes care of itself and it markets itself to a large degree, and as long as you keep fulfilling the public in terms of the quality of the show. I mean, one of the great things about Stomp is our creators have never abandoned the show, and we're all used to directors after a year or so. It's the second stage manager who's keeping the show in shape. As long as you can keep the show delivering the goods night after night, I think you can keep getting audiences to come back to it. Once you take your eye off the ball and the quality of the show begins to dissipate, even slightly, then that show's days are numbered. the audience will move on. They're much more attuned to the quality levels of shows than we ever give them any respect for.
There's an irony to me in this issue of the event shows, because some of the ones you mentioned, like Stomp and Blue Man Group and De La Guardia, that's material that 20 years ago might have been thought of even as performance art. And suddenly it's become the most successful commercial.
Well, 50 years ago it might have been referred to as vaudeville, but or 75 years ago. Yes, except that there are linkages and an arc to those shows that don't exist in the kind of performance art world. If somebody smarter than I could give you an analysis of why De La Guardia or Stomp or Blue Man work, I think they could take it apart and deconstruct it and show you a really wonderful structure beneath that the piece, which pulls the audience along.
Well, I mean, I have a theory about that, but it doesn't mean you can clone it. That's
Right.
the problem, because in all of theater, you can't clone what were hits, whether it's on Broadway or off-Broadway. You can't say, okay, I'm going to be the producer of a new off-Broadway show. It came to me and said, I want to be just like Little Shop of Horrors. I said, you can't,
Right.
because that was 25 years ago, and you're not going to be able to make that model. Even 2 years later, nobody could. But we live in a world where everything in showbiz is immediately available to us. We can get almost every movie, every TV show, whenever we want it, on demand. So whether it's Netflix or Nickelodeon or whatever it is, so the theater has to be able to set itself apart from that. We have to do what we do differently than TV and movies, and that is about having a live experience with a bunch of other people in the audience who interact emotionally, usually, with the audience that sets us apart. And that's what those three shows do. But it's also what Spelling Bee does. I think it's what the big Broadway shows do as well. So we need to cultivate that which can't be cloned on TV. I mean, I think Altar Boys is that way, is that you have to be in the room to really experience that. And that's what sets us apart. But I don't know how to clone it. I don't know how to tell an author and creatives how to make that happen. It's something that's organically in the material, and hopefully we as producers spot it and can make it economically viable in order to make it happen.
Sorry.
I'm just going to comment on something Nancy said. I mean, the essential difference between the theater and every other medium is the theater is a writer's medium. The ownership of the material rests with the authors. We can try and change the material as producers, but we don't own it. It's not like the movie business, in which the material is owned by the producers. So even if we wanted to clone it, it's going to come out as somebody's vision, because it's usually a single author who's developing that. Musicals are much more collaborative than straight plays, but even there, it is the vision of the author, lyricist, and composer that comes through, not our vision.
Well, since you mentioned straight plays, because that's really the first time so far that's come up, we've talked about event shows, we've talked about musicals per se. Certainly there was a time when we would see commercial runs of things like Pete Gurney's plays coming out of Playwrights Horizons, or I mentioned before Steel Magnolias. What's the prognosis? Other People's Money, which played in one of your theaters. What's the prognosis for plays off-Broadway as commercial runs? Is that still
I think
feasible?
what Marc is talking about is going to happen, is the pendulum, as the Broadway theaters fill, and right now they're filled, and in the 80s they weren't. They weren't even close to being filled. But now, almost, I believe there's one, maybe two Broadway theaters that don't have something in it or about to be in it. And as the Broadway theaters fill and as the runs get longer, there's not going to be a place to do the plays, and I think the pendulum will swing them back into off-Broadway potentially.
Yeah, we have an inherent difficulty, which is the nonprofits, which used to be a large place from which most of the straight plays came to the commercial off-Broadway houses, have found it more beneficial for themselves in terms of fundraising and identification to try to move those shows to Broadway. And there are a number of inexperienced producers that have taken those shows and moved them to Broadway because they can. And the difficulty with that is most of those shows do not do well in large Broadway houses. They lack the intimacy. The relationship between the audience and the show is not as good as it is in an off-Broadway situation. So plays like Lieutenant of Inishmore that moved to Broadway in this season, or even a show as successful as I Am My Own Wife, could probably still be running in an off-Broadway situation. But we don't control the nonprofits, and they have other needs and desires. I think ultimately they may make a financial decision and say, you know, it might be better to have a show running a year and a half and receive royalties off that show than rushing to try to get that initial burst of publicity. But that is a difficulty for us.
As we talk about sort of the perceptions of Broadway and off-Broadway, and you're talking about size, there was a study commissioned by the League of Off-Broadway Theaters and Producers and the Theater Development Fund. And within that study, they brought out some points that they discovered in asking audiences what the difference between Broadway and off-Broadway is, and indeed what the positive elements for off-Broadway is. And there were 6 points. No crowds, no tourists, the work is more offbeat and less commercial, the work is more interactive, the sight lines are better, and the audiences have better theater manners. Do you think that really is the reality of going to off-Broadway, or is that a perception based even on what off-Broadway might have been a while ago?
I think what a lot of those comments speak to is that the audience that goes to off-Broadway is a niche audience. I mean, it is in general, I would say, a bit more sophisticated than Broadway. You're looking at sort of a narrower skew. So those are people who are, you know, New Yorkers, and I mean a lot of the audience skews much more local off-Broadway because you have to know about it. I mean, one of the challenges that we have as producers is to let people know about our shows, and especially off-Broadway, we've got limited dollars. We can't. A Broadway show will spend $75,000, $100,000 a week to advertise. We spend somewhere between $6,000 and $20,000 a week to advertise, you know, and I think there aren't a lot of shows that can afford to spend $20,000 a week. So, you know, by that very fact, we are limited in our ability to reach out to people. So people have to do a little more work and find us, and the people that are going to be able to do that are more likely to be New Yorkers, as Ken's experience when he was talking about Altar Boys and the audience, you know, the people who said, oh, I need to have a Broadway experience. When people come to New York who are tourists, they want a Broadway experience. And one of our challenges is to tell them, hey, you should try an off-Broadway experience, and that's something that, you know, is certainly a goal of ours. But how realistic that is, how you know, if we can actually convince people, you know, to go to an off-Broadway show, that has to be part of their New York visit. I don't know how, you know, how well we'll succeed.
Well, take our show, Stomp, which attracts a lot. You know, I generally agree with that list of stuff, but then again, every one of those things there are exceptions to. I mean, the Stomps and Blue Men's. We have no dearth of tourists coming to those shows. The difference is, I think, that if you hear that your cousin is coming in and you say, God, what show can I sit through again that I would enjoy to see, the chances are better that a native New Yorker is going to want to take somebody to a Stomp.
Ken, how do you get the message out? In the case of Altar Boys, you didn't have a cast that was known. You didn't have certainly a title that anybody had heard before. You had a concept. You had an idea. How did you go about building awareness for that show?
Well, I think the first answer to that is you have to realize, as Alan said in the beginning, we get about 1, maybe 2 hits a season. I disagree only because I judge hit a little bit more on the economic viability of a show.
The old rule of thumb of whether it recoups or not?
To somewhat. I mean, and there is this, where I sat down at a union negotiation where I said, okay, we have to address certain issues, and the representative turned to me and said, come on, everyone knows you can't make any money off Broadway. Now, I was shocked at that statement, because while there may be a reality to that in the last 10 years or 5 years, certainly some people are, and also that kind of complacency is exactly what I believe we need to start to fix in order to continue to swing this pendulum back the other direction. And part of fixing that, I mean, when you get to a certain point, you develop attraction. I mean, there's no question. The brand awareness comes after time.
That's right.
There's no coincidence that most of these off-Broadway musicals, plays, are closing within a 3-month period, because the economics are so difficult. They can't make it over that hump. I actually think it took Altar Boys a year for the word of mouth to kick in. It's not 6 months anymore. It's a year. And most shows can't function economically for that period of time. If we can find a way to make this model work, if these shows can run longer, then they will last longer and hopefully hit that level of recoupment. And part of that, about Altar Boy specifically, and about how we got the word out, we do a lot of different things. I mean, a lot of it was, we hear the same things from the advertiser. Okay, here's the big direct mail, here's this, here's that, and the New York Times and all this. And we did it at the beginning. And what we saw was, it wasn't coming back fast enough. It just wasn't. We had we did a focus group for Altar Boys at the beginning, and what I was most pleased about was we had like a 68% awareness of the show, which was fantastic in like the first 3 months. Only about 4 to 5 percentage points off from Spelling Bee. Big Broadway show, big advertising budget. There was an awareness, but we were still very to the bottom of people's must-see list. And what was above were all the Broadway shows. So we had to figure out a way to notch ourselves up that list. Number one, to notch yourself up, you just got to stick around for a long period of time. And then we went in a totally aggressive, much more guerrilla and very internet, aggressive campaign that was talked about in the New York Times. We do a ton of not only email blasts but social peer-to-peer networking, all that sort of thing. We have an exclusive fan site called alterholics.com. We noticed a rabid fan following of the show, and I'm a big believer in what I call fan the flame marketing. When you see a little something, you go blow on it so that hopefully it will explode. And we gave them this exclusive site where people are looking for a community, and we gave them a site where they could talk about it and spread the word about it, all just because this site was there for them. And that's part of this new economic model that is necessary. Ads in the Times for Altar Boys, they don't poll. They don't do it. So why would we? And we have to find other ways to do it. And we have to tell our vendors and the ad agencies and everyone saying, you know what, the old model isn't working. We've got to find some new way.
Nancy, with a long runner like I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change, how long did it take for that to hit its stride?
It did take a year for I Love You, You're Perfect. What I Love You, You're Perfect has that if you go to see a show that's called I Love You, Perfect, Now Change, you are not disappointed. Because if that's a show that you chose to go through, you know it's about relationships and you know it's funny. And so it became a straight date musical in the 10 years ago. And that was a rarity at the time. But it took a year. It did take a year. It took a TV campaign. TV is very different today. When we started in the business, I was in the early 80s. We did Little Shop of Horrors, had a dedicated TV campaign. There was a certain amount of money set aside for TV every week. It was a brilliant commercial that they did, but there were only 5 channels. Now, where do you go on TV? It's very difficult. So we need to enter a world of what Ken's doing, which is permission marketing. We need to go to people find a way to get to the people who want us. And the internet offers us that opportunity, but it is so difficult to figure out how to navigate through it, and that still takes time. It's still not overnight. So that's tricky. And also, I mean, the biggest concern I have is that the economic model is broken. Doesn't mean that hits don't happen. Ticket prices are too high. Off-Broadway ticket prices are now $75 top price because you need to sell discounts. And so if you're going to send a discount, you need to make the high price high enough so you can discount it so you're still getting money, so you're not selling $12 tickets, because showcases allow you to do $12 tickets, but you can never make your money back. So the ticket prices are high. We're now getting Broadway designers who are working off-Broadway. They have huge physical productions. I mean, when we started off-Broadway, I mean, and we did. I mean, we were like a second wave of off-Broadway. I mean, it was a second job. The reason that you did 4 shows on the weekend, 2 Saturday, 2 Sunday, because half the people on the show worked all week at a regular job. And they did it out of love and passion and lunacy. And everybody, because you couldn't make any money, even if you were on an equity contract. So it's tricky. So that the economic model is something we have to address, and I don't know where to begin.
But has there been more of a merging of the perception of Broadway and off-Broadway, notwithstanding the Irish people who heard they were off-Broadway and
I don't think
wanted
so.
to get out?
I think they're very separate audiences. Very separate audiences. I mean, sure, there's an overlap, but I think there are a lot of tourists who I want to go to a Broadway show.
So who's coming to Stomp or I Love You, You're Perfect Now Change 10 years on?
A lot of tourists.
I think a lot of tourists, but again, can you hang on long? I mean, Ken should begin to be tapping into that because he's been around long enough after a year and a half.
It's what's interesting about that study, to quote some of the other stats in there, is there was, I took all the stats from that study and compared it to Broadway stats, actually. Because while Broadway's economic model is certainly challenged as well.
We hear it all the time.
Exactly. I mean, it's a very difficult industry, and we tend to get, Off-Broadway tends to get trickle-down audiences, and we get trickle-down economics. So if their Broadway economic model is challenged, ours is even more. Our audiences come from them. When the Broadway shows are sold out, then we start to sell more. There's no question. And so what I did was lay those stats side by side. We get 10% more males off-Broadway than on Broadway. We get 10% less tourists. And there is, in my mind, I call it the magic 10%. Because everyone got excited. Oh, and 10% our age demographic is younger. And everyone kind of got excited. Like we're younger, and we're getting males, and we're getting locals. And what I said is, wait a minute, we're not getting females, we're not getting a slightly older, and we're not getting those tourists, which make Broadway function. There is that, and this advertising agencies will tell you all the time, and there is some truth to that about the average typical theater goer. The 55-year-old woman, the 45-year-old woman, etc. And that chunk is missing from Off-Broadway based on those stats. And we have to figure out a way, and this is where Off-Broadway has always been this place where let's do things different. The Awesome 80s Prom, let's do things where bachelorette parties can go and have a great time. But we also need to find a way to continue to make it more economically viable, to make sure we're accessible at the same time and not pushing a certain sector away.
I disagree with you. Making it accessible would make us into an adjunct of Broadway, and making us as an adjunct of Broadway, we will never win that battle. Because Broadway's always going to win. They're always going to have more money and more accessibility to the media. We need to define ourselves for what we do best, which are more cutting edge, I think more sophisticated, more intelligent material. I don't think if we broaden out our material and try to get the 45 to 55-year-old woman, we're going to succeed in that battle. I think, we talk about getting a new economic model. What I think we need is an old economic model, which is the impassioned producer taking full control over the production and trying to figure out every possible way of selling tickets. One of the lethargies that Off-Broadway settled into over the last 10 years was almost a Broadway corporate attitude towards producing. I'll pick up 9 producers and we'll hire a general management firm, and we'll let the general managers provide the direction for the show. there are some really good general management firms, but there's no general manager that's ever going to replace the passion of a producer or the drive of a producer to get his or her show seen by the audience. I don't think that we can try to replicate ourselves as Broadway. I think doing edgier material would be better for us, trying to find the plays that new playwrights that Broadway won't touch is what Off-Broadway did for decades and succeeded in.
Well, I mean, any play is a play that Broadway won't touch. I mean, Broadway doesn't do plays unless stars are in them, you know, and
Right.
I think what Off-Broadway can theoretically afford to do are plays that are good plays. But it is very different today than it was 20 years ago. I mean, the shows that my partners produced in the early 80s, which were all transfers from not-for-profit theaters, Frankie and Johnny and the Clair de Lune, Driving Miss Daisy, The Cocktail Hour, you know, those were all successful shows. I mean, they were commercially successful. They recouped their investment. They made profits. As the 80s wore on and we got to the 90s, our shows that we transferred from the not-for-profit didn't succeed, and that, you know, and that led us to say, I don't, you know, and maybe it was just the shows, you know, maybe, and because that happens, you know, some shows are more commercial, some shows work, some shows don't. The audiences are engaged or not, but it definitely, there was something that happened where the audiences weren't coming in the numbers that it would take to recoup, and like I said, I do think that the pendulum will swing back. There was a period that isn't that long ago, which was right before Broadway sort of got healthier, where you couldn't get an off-Broadway theater as a producer. I had a show that needed a theater, and we waited a year and a half for a theater. And another show, you know, we were constantly signing backup contracts for theaters because we just couldn't get an available theater. And then one day that changed, you know, and it was sort of overnight, and it became, you know, any show that you had, you could go to every theater owner and say, I have this show, and they would engage in a discussion. We're somewhere better than that today, you know, because it's not quite that simple. So we'll see, you know, stay tuned.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a very short break and hear a little more about the work of the American Theater Wing.
The American Theater Wing has played a vital role in New York's theatrical life for more than 60 years. We stand for excellence, and we support education in the theater.
Best known for creating the Tony Award, our work reaches beyond Broadway and New York.
These seminar programs, which are supported by the Annenberg Foundation and the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, are an unequaled forum for discussions with today's most creative artists.
Downstage Center's in-depth interviews are heard on XM satellite radio. Our grant and scholarship programs support New York theater companies and theater students. And since we began, we have given away more than $2.5 million.
Our theater intern group helps young people who are just starting in their careers build a professional network.
And Springboard NYC is a 2-week boot camp for aspiring actors from colleges across the country.
All of the American Theater Wing's educational and media programs are available for free, on demand, from our website, americantheaterwing.org.
Now, let's return to the seminar.
God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me. Put it in me. God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me. Put it, put it, put it, put it. God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me, God put the rhythm in me. Let me tell you, God put it in me, and that's where it's gonna stay. Yeah, yeah. God put it in me, and that's where it's gonna stay.
We've just been looking at a little bit from Altar Boys, the off-Broadway musical, and we were talking earlier about the establishment of a brand off-Broadway, and Altar Boys is now set to go out on tour. We certainly hear things about tours being challenging, even sometimes for certain Broadway shows, going out, if they don't have a star, can they tour? Does success for some off-Broadway productions really come when it reaches that point with a brand that it is indeed known, and then it can go out, and in fact, can it do better once it's left New York than it actually can do here?
Well, I literally just got off a plane 2 hours ago from the opening in Chicago, and I can tell you that one of the things I'm most excited about the show is just that in New York, about 2,400 people see the show on a weekly basis. Last night at the LaSalle Bank Theater in Chicago, 1,700 saw it in one night. I mean, this 10-to-1 ratio of exposure, and we all know that word of mouth is what sells tickets, of the number of people literally seeing my show, as well as the advertising materials now all over the country. I have this belief in kind of a connect the dots type of approach of brand, where now there's where I can't, those tourists that keep the New York theater scene going. I mean, that's why after 9/11 they would come to New York and see a Broadway show, because without those tourists we were in a very difficult situation. I need those people to keep Altar Boys running. I can't survive on just the locals, because our locals are very smart and very whimsical, and they're always on to the next coolest thing. And it will be hard to sustain them. So I need all those people around the country. And what the tour, which is entirely, it's actually an off-Broadway model economically on the road, very different, because we faced, when we were trying to sell it, we had this award-winning musical comedy and everyone was raving about it. And of course, presenters around the country said, yeah, but my folks in Birmingham may not know about it. And what we decided to do was, price it so economically that it was a way for them to seriously reduce the risk. And we, at the same time, had the ability to expose our brand. And hopefully, I can't wait to see what happens in the next 6 months to a year with Altar Boys here in New York, when 500,000 people see the show over those 30 weeks, where it takes a year and a half to do that.
And when it tours, is it playing venues where it's on a season at a performing arts center along with those Broadway tours?
Yeah.
At that point, does the perception completely
Absolutely.
get erased?
And that's what, I'm not a big proponent of go see a Broadway show, go see an off-Broadway show. I would like to just go see a show. And actually, the people who did the survey results, there is, and I forget the exact stats, but there is that of 1 out of 5, there's a couple people that just want to see a show. They don't really even yet know, and that's what I want to do, is blur the line. Look, we call it Off-Broadway. Whoever came up with that name was a horrible marketing person. I mean, it says off in the title.
Because it's about what you're not instead
exactly.
of what you are.
And back then it was something cool. We're off, we're hip, come see us, we're edgy. Economically, we can't afford to be that anymore, in my opinion. So what I hope that the tour will do for us is blur that line a little bit. Put us next to Spamalot, put us next to Wicked, all those shows, and then when it's come to New York, it's, I just want to see Altar Boys.
And certainly I Love You has had that bounce back. I think that as it's gone across the country, there is a sense of people saying, oh, I saw that at home. I'd like to see it in New York. And the Off-Broadway is actually defined, is a geographically defined area by Equity, and we're 1 block off of that. So we're very close to Times Square, and that helps. Because one of the problems with Off-Broadway is it's in the Village, it's in, it's way south of here, it's where the streets get confusing. The streets in Midtown for tourists are very clear, and it's north-south, numbers, all of that is very clear.
Well, the most confusing example would be the theater that the Fantastics is in right now, which is literally on Broadway, but because of the size of the house, it's an off-Broadway theater. So the distinction continues to blur. But do you think, Alan, I'm curious, what Ken has said about the no distinction, your feeling, you were saying earlier, you think that there still needs to be a definition of the difference between the two.
I guess it depends on the show that you're producing. I think there's validity in trying to have no distinction and having people seeing every possible show. I just think that we do better. We are able to separate ourselves from the Broadway world, grab more attention, be able to have greater focus and media attention if we go to the edgier material because the critics like the edgier material. Off-Broadway's been more critic-friendly in terms of the straight plays that it's done over time than Broadway has.
The edgier material isn't actually proving that successful either off-Broadway. I mean, some of the show, I Love You, You're Perfect, you know, no offense, I don't consider that edgy material.
Well, Blue Man and Stomp
But Bug is an edgy show.
Right. Oleana was an edgy
Killer Joe.
Killer Joe is an edgy. There are a lot of shows.
All those shows have closed. I mean, that's the.
But they all had good runs.
But that's the thing. I mean, Killer Joe, I don't know, but doesn't have the brand recognition across the country. Isn't being done at theaters all over the place.
I don't know if we know that, but I don't think it's ever going to. It's it's so edgy. I mean, that it falls off that economic model. It was successful in New York. I think it paid back. And I'm sure that some people are doing it across the country, but it's never going to have that huge name recognition that The Odd Couple has.
Well,
it's not going to be done in dinner theaters.
Take Oleana for an example, which was a David Mamet show, which I and a number of people did down at the Orpheum Theater just before Stomp came in. We had a year-and-a-half run. We more than tripled our investment on that show. It became a cause célèbre in New York City. We took it to London. We recouped that show in 5 weeks in London. Marc did a revival of that.
Which recouped and made money in London as well.
Yeah.
What year was that?
Well, his revival last year before.
In London?
But
what year was the original here that had that triple?
13 years ago.
Okay. So that for me is, and there is room certainly for edgier material off Broadway, and I encourage it. If we're going to say that it's a place for edgier stuff, we also can't complain if the people aren't rushing to see it.
Well, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think people will rush to see edgier material faster than they will rush to see softer material because it creates a groundswell of people who are in the know, in the first circle of audience members off Broadway, which is, as we all know, critical mass is the most important thing about a show, getting a large number of people into it as quickly as possible to get word of mouth out there. Can I point to an edgy show? Well, Lieutenant of Inishmore was an edgy show, which should have run off-Broadway, which ran to Broadway, and because the cost structure on Broadway is even worse for plays than it is off-Broadway, didn't make it. Is there room for more universal musicals and for edgier material off-Broadway? Certainly there is, and I don't mean to denigrate any of those three categories. I've participated in all three of those categories happily, and made money in each of those three categories. But if we want to try to get attention to off-Broadway, to differentiate us, your point is we don't want to differentiate us. My point is I do want to differentiate us because I think it is more valuable to differentiate us and to get more focus and attention on us, and therefore create larger and larger audiences.
I think if we don't sell the specialness of off-Broadway, the intimacy that really doesn't exist in a Broadway theater, then we're fighting the battle against the $75,000 a week paycheck of the advertising budget of Broadway with our $6,000, $8,000, $10,000, $12,000 off-Broadway budget, and that's a really hard battle to win. So it is necessary. I mean, I don't know how it translates into actually what you do, but in fact, celebrating the uniqueness of the off-Broadway experience, the fact that you're sitting within 5 or 6 rows of the stage, the fact that as Nancy mentioned earlier, we're selling the idea that you're there, you're live, you're in the room, and you're a part of it, and it's a very different thing to be a part of something with 300 people than it is to be with 1,500 people. I mean, it's just a different experience.
But I do think we need to change the model, and I'm trying to change the model. I have a project this season where I have a holiday show, New York City is not very responsive to holiday shows unless you're Radio City. Madison Square Garden pulled it off, but these are giant venues that had giant holiday shows with huge audiences, with huge title recognition. So I have a holiday show, not about Christmas, not about Hanukkah, about New Year's Eve. It should really only play the holidays. It's going to run 8 weeks at the Darryl Roth Theater. And it was, the way you get a theater off-Broadway is you stand in line. You have to be behind someone. But I needed something that would only happen at the holidays. So we just got a theater because there happened to be an opening of 8 weeks at the theater. It's a band called Groove Lily. Very edgy and mainstream both. And hopefully we're capitalizing it to do 2 years. So we can do it this year and we can do it next year, because we would like to bring it back every year. And if we're successful this year, someone will say, I want you in my theater this year. That's what we hope will happen.
No one had bought anything of her the whole day, nor had anyone given her even a penny.
Wouldn't you think, tonight of all nights, when the snow lays a blanket on the ice-laden streetlights, wouldn't you think that a match would come in handy in the dark? Excuse me, sir, pardon me, would you like to see my matches for sale?
As we go through this discussion, the pronoun we keeps getting thrown around, both obviously in individual productions, but even in the idea of what Off-Broadway has to do to build its awareness. Are there particular efforts? Are there enough resources within the people who are working off-Broadway to deal with the results of this survey, to put things into play, or does a survey like this still only influence the individual shows and how they choose to do their work?
Well, part of, I think, unfortunately I wasn't here when the kind of off-Broadway movement started, but part of what I hear its success was, it was about this theater that existed in the alleys and where no one could find you. The unions couldn't find you, those sort of things. It was, let's do the edgier stuff, and it was about the individual. And what I have been a huge proponent of is those days are over. One, the unions have found us, and I think they can help us as well. I mean, union performers and all the sort of thing, we can level we can raise the level of our productions, etc. So I'm a big fan of getting everyone together, and this survey is the first kind of, I think, result of that. There's a group that works along with the League as well called, we refer to ourselves as the Off-Broadway Brainstormers, which is about 50 to 75 people, started by Beverly McKeon, who's the executive director at New World Stages, who was faced with a couple of empty theaters and didn't understand why. And she had just moved to the country, and she said, well, when we can't understand why, let's get everyone in a room and talk about it. And we did. And for the first time, all of these people came out from the woodwork and the alleys and saying, hey, I have that problem too, I have that problem too. Let's talk about the steps that we can take together. One of those things that we pushed for was this the survey. Another major initiative was, for the first time, and we're still actually struggling to make this work, is to get the off-Broadway producers to share information, including their grosses and what they're doing. I was a chair of kind of an economic subcommittee based on this new economic model, and one of the things that came out was, well, I believe that you have to see what the market can bear before you design a budget, before you create. Let's see how many people are coming. Let's see what the average gross is off-Broadway, and let's create a model that fits within that. So hopefully we can maintain some economic viability within what the market is doing. So, and that was a struggle. To be very honest, there are still a lot of off-Broadway producers that I don't want to share my numbers. Well, why?
Once upon a time, they were reported in Variety, just like the Broadway grosses.
And I understand. The irony is a lot of us report our numbers to unions, etc., but we didn't want to share it with each other, which was, for me, a little mind-boggling. And here was where we got to use these numbers to our advantage. We talk about new economic model. Well, here it is. We got results from about 14 to 15 shows over a 6-month period. We averaged them out, and averaged about 200 people a night are coming to Off-Broadway. So the old idea, when people talk about, let's go to a 499-seat house, why? There aren't off-Broadway shows selling out 499-seat houses. So let's let's start take a look at how many people are coming. Let's start to take a look at what the average gross is per week and figure out ways where we can produce within that model. The old general manager trick, and I'm one of them. I was a company manager and general manager for big Broadway musicals for years. And what we always do is say, here's how it looks in a 350, here's how you'll recoup in a 500, here's how you'll recoup in a 2,000-seat house. Well, just because you're in a bigger house, especially off-Broadway, doesn't mean that you're going to fill it. In fact, the numbers that we got proves that. We're not filling it. I hope to one day bounce those numbers up, but at the moment we have to concentrate on what we have to work with.
Ken, I disagree with your premise. So the reason to have a 499-seat house is called The Weekend. Which
they don't come. I'm in arguably the most successful off-Broadway musical to open in the last few years. I would not sell out a 499-seat house on The Weekend. And with what the theater owners are charged, this is the, and talk about economic model problem, what I have to do is pay rent for a 499-seat house for 1 week a year, Christmas. For a 52, for those couple of weekends that I may sell more than my 350 or more than the 200, it does not, the model that is given to us by the
we're
theater.
still selling out at Stomp on Saturday nights. And
How many seats are you there?
347.
Okay.
Okay. When I just did Billy Connolly, or I didn't do it, Arnold Engelman did Billy Connolly at 37 Arts. He sold out 499 seats for most of his shows, but particularly Friday and Saturday nights. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday on shows that are not absolute sellouts. Those are lesser houses, and they bring the average down for the week. But Friday, Saturday, that's when you need the capacity.
And that's probably no different than on Broadway as well. There are shows that are soft, but
Agreed. Yeah, I think that the weekends are strong, and you sell out your weekends, and then people say, "Oh, I can't go on Saturday, so I guess I'll go Tuesday."
Off-Broadway, we have a slight advantage because we do a 5-show weekend. Friday to Saturday to Sunday. But that's my experience in today's world.
Are you selling out Fantastics on the weekends?
Yeah, we sell out quite a few performances. When
Could
you say
sell
the
at
weekends,
$4.99? Do you think you could sell $4.99?
no, but that's why we produced it in a 200-seat theater. But on the other hand, one of the next shows that I'm going to produce, Mayumana, I wouldn't think of doing it in anything other than a 499-seat theater. It wouldn't work. I couldn't afford to do it. I mean, there are a lot of things you just can't afford to do if you only have 200 seats.
And my counter for that is you say you can't afford to do it on paper. What I think is we've got the data now that says this is the average of what you're going to gross.
But that's the problem with that's the problem with using an average, Ken. It doesn't hold. That data doesn't translate into anything. You're taking an average across the board. If you take an average of failed shows and add them to successful shows, you're going to bring down the number of seats as an average. The mean will drop
But then you're only producing for a smash hit again. I mean, that's the thing. What I'm trying to do is create an economic model that exists for something in the
God bless you, and I hope you can. But this has been a business since the 18th century that has always been about smash hits. It's not been about marginal shows. Do we get some occasionally? Yes. But most of them, the shows that run for a long period of time at a success, reach a level of success. It's like a glider. You got to get high enough to go far enough. Most of, I hope your model works, and I hope you're successful in making it work. As a landlord, I would be the first person benefited by it, but it's not my experience. My experience is we're going to have the 1 to 2 shows a year that are going to be hits. And they're going to sell out their run as long as there are hits. And as Nancy noted before, if their ticket prices are at full price when they initially are hit, they can sail for another couple of years discounting their tickets. And if they institutionalize themselves, then they can go on for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. That's my experience. I'm certainly willing to look at a new model, and if you can make it work, God bless you. I hope it does work. It'll help me.
Now, we're talking about economic models, and I want to come back to the issue of whether Off-Broadway can sell the perception and the value of going to Off-Broadway. Can there be the Off-Broadway Got Milk campaign? Is that something that the Off-Broadway League has looked at, and is that feasible again in working in an arena where the economic means inevitably are more limited?
Well, Marc should answer that. I have a different opinion, but
I think the answer is certainly with the brainstormers, it's something that people are looking at.
Yeah.
Where we would find the money to pay for such a campaign is a big question mark, and I think even Ken says that he's not sure that selling the idea of Off-Broadway is what he wants to do. He's more interested in blurring the lines. So I don't think that there will be like a consensus that's the ultimate answer to how we're going to solve the issues of Off-Broadway. I do think there are certain things that we've learned from the focus groups that we conducted that tell us that one of the things that people like about Off-Broadway is that it is a spontaneous thing, or it can be a spontaneous thing.
Spontaneous to go to it, or spontaneous
to go to it. That for a Broadway show, it's a commitment. You know it's going to cost a couple $100s just for the tickets. If you're going to spend that much money on tickets and you need the babysitter, you want to make an event of it, you want to have dinner at a nice restaurant, you want to park, it's a big deal. It's like it's a huge dollar commitment, and you don't want to make a mistake. So therefore, you want to go to a musical that you've heard of. You want the stamp of approval of the New York Times. You want as much absolute certainty as you can get from that experience. Off-Broadway, the value is different. The price point isn't as high, tickets are more available, and it doesn't have to be such a big deal. It's closer to the idea of going to a movie. It's not going to a movie, it's still a much bigger deal because it's much more expensive. But with a movie, it's like, if I don't like it, big deal. It costs $10, $11. For an Off-Broadway show, we still have some traction to the idea that the spontaneity, the idea that you can take a flyer on an Off-Broadway show, there's an audience in New York that feels that way. And I think part of the key to us succeeding is to figure out a way to encourage people who feel that way, find those people and remind them about that fact and get them to come more often.
Part of what you're saying then is that there's less at stake, there's less expectations out of what both they have to invest in the experience and what they're going to take out of the experience. Nancy, do you think that's true, that people somehow expect less when they go to an Off-Broadway show, or will accept something that's noticeably less produced than what you see on
That isn't
Broadway?
what I was saying. I mean, that wasn't my point, that they expect
No,
less.
not specifically. I'm teasing
less.
that out.
Okay.
But do they have to deliver every bit as much, even if the price point is less?
I think from an emotional experience, yes. Unfortunately, we seem to feel like we have to deliver chandeliers and helicopters and gigantic effects, and that's trickled down to Off-Broadway in, I think, a detrimental way, because the physical productions become so overburdened, and I don't think that's what people go to see shows for, because now that we can morph on TV and movies, we can't ever compete in legitimate theater with physical effects. And so I think it's about the emotional experience, but unfortunately, I think our directors and our designers and our producers feel like, oh my gosh, I've got to protect myself, I have to have a huge physical production because I'm charging $110 for tickets. But if the emotional experience is amazing, the price doesn't matter, except going in the door, which is what Marc's saying. Is that what we're doing is people will experiment for $25 or $35. But do you experiment? And that's where Off-Broadway makes me nervous. I don't think $75 is an experimental price anymore. But when we did the original Little Shop, the price was $35.
But it was the highest price.
That was the highest price, and now it's more than double that, because theater ticket prices, whether it's Broadway or Off-Broadway, have not gone with inflation. They are they're geometrically higher proportions than inflation.
But you can still get a very inexpensive ticket to most Off-Broadway shows.
And on Broadway as well, which is the biggest competition.
Just because the retail price, this is New York, folks. You don't have to pay retail for everything. You can find ways of seeing shows at a lot cheaper prices than what's marked on the ticket, and those tickets are out there, whether it's through TDF, TKTS, or private discounting that each of the shows do. Nancy's touched on one issue, which is a trend towards overproduction off-Broadway, which is in what Ken's talking about, trying to find a new economic model. A lot more money are spent on shows than should be spent on shows. I don't think the quality of scenically or lighting-wise or sound-wise, it merits the amount of money that is spent on them now, vis-a-vis the 25, 30 years ago, in which the technology would not allow us to spend that much money. The play is the thing. The material is the most important part of it. I think our insecurities as producers and creative people cause us to throw money at situations which creativity should be used more than dollars.
I totally agree with that. I mean, although I disagree with Nancy a little bit in that I don't think people are price resistant. I think they're value resistant. We live in this, extra value meal society now, where people will often, they just want the chips and the soda along with it, and they'll spend more money than just the sandwich. It's something I do at the Awesome 80s Prom, which is an interactive, club theater style event. I have tickets $49.99, $59.99 includes a drink, a photo, and a piece of 80s candy. Up to $89.99, they get open bar and reserved seating, and we sell an inordinate amount of those special package prices. And I, as a producer, actually net more money when they buy those packages, but they think they're getting so much more. There's a value attached to it. And the value is, of course, in the content. The content is what it's about. People pay, and to use a movie analogy, people pay $10, $12 to see Titanic the movie at $100 million or whatever it is, and they pay $10 to see the Blair Witch Project. And it's about the content and making sure the content satisfies the experience. But I don't think people, yes, they'll obviously always want to pay the cheapest amount that they can. But every time we notch up, the reason it keeps notching up is that people keep buying the tickets.
Let me demur just slightly on that, and Marc can speak to this since he was part of the creation of the premium seat concept. But, when I have shows in the theaters that people want to see, the premium seats, the seats that are inordinately highly priced, are the seats that go first.
Right.
It's not the cheaper seats. We go dead with more cheap seats than we do with higher price seats. So there are lots of ways to see shows at very inexpensive levels. Most people don't want to see them at that level. They would rather pay, as Marc said, the highest price for something they're sure is a hit.
Well, the location, what we constantly hear from the people is that what they want is a good seat. Yeah. It's not cheap right off the bat. Every focus group, they want to know where they're sitting and that it's good.
But there's an audience that really doesn't feel that they can afford $75 or $100 for tickets. And I believe in order to run years, you have to have a huge number of people. Lots and lots of people, and there are people that won't go unless they can get that discount.
Yeah, well,
we can have this argument for days. But
I think the discount's available in most shows. You can do rush tickets an hour before the show in many theaters for $25 to see a show that costs $75 top. You can go through all the discounting venues. You can see those shows at a reduced price if you want to work at it. If you don't want to work at it, you can call the ticket broker and pay $400.
We are in and it was actually the internet, I think, that started the discounted-minded society that we're in now, because they're the ones that, like the theater, had inventory that at a certain point was dead. They had empty, plane seats, and if they couldn't sell them, there was just lost money. So they started blasting these last-minute weekend fares, which is what I believe started this kind of internet craze of discounting. And there was a book about Walmart where they said, people in America now feel entitled to a discount. It is no longer just, I'm lucky to get one. It is part of the fabric of the American now that I feel like I deserve a discount. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge to us, because the $21 tickets, while I love when, to get in the members of TDF, they're not going to make my show run for a long period of time if I sell, a couple hundred $21 tickets per night.
Yet, at the same time, we have a phenomenon like now the premium seating on Broadway, and people who will pay whatever it takes to get the best seat. Your scenario on Awesome 80s Prom, you give them something at each step of the way. When you buy the premium seats on Broadway, what you're getting is convenience. You can, because of the price, they're probably more available. Does that model relate to Off-Broadway, or is that a Broadway phenomenon?
No, I mean, I Love You has premium seats, The Fantastics has premium seats, and there's nothing, I mean, they're good locations, but they're not, you don't get anything else other than
and
the
you
seat.
could have certainly bought a ticket at the box office comparable to it, but there is a value to it. But your TDF people, they go to everything. And that's the difference, is the people who buy premium seats don't go to everything. They don't say, oh, I'm going to buy a premium seat for every show there is. I'm going to pick the show I want to see and buy a premium seat. And that's where my concern is that there are so many entertainment dollars, and Off-Broadway isn't always getting them.
And that's the premium seat. There's always someone that wants to fly first class. There's just always someone that wants to sit in the front of the plane. And that's the premium seat, I think, started on Broadway because with the producers, it was the only way to get in the door. People wanted to see Matthew and Nathan, and they couldn't get in. So they sold a premium. Now, off-Broadway, again, we have a supply and demand problem off-Broadway. We can't fill 8 shows a week. So the premium ticket is a harder sell there for me because they can get in whenever they want. So what I do, and we have one on Altar Boys, we have a heavenly VIP package where I give them a CD, a T-shirt, and Meet the Boys, which of course doesn't cost me anything. And I have a value opportunity when hopefully we can encourage them to buy more, because I know they can walk up and just get any ticket, unlike the producers.
Well, on Billy Connolly, which basically sold out its run, we sold out the premium seats first. It's just
and the Fantastics, which some performances are sold out, some aren't. We sell a number of premium seats to non-sold out performances. There are only 200 seats in the theater, so every single location is a good view of the stage. It's not about that.
One little thing about premium seats, which part of the motivation for premium seats was to deal with scalpers, so that money, at least that was spent on tickets, would come back to the production, as opposed to somebody in New Jersey who has a post office box who's collecting a lot of money that should go to all the royalty participants as well. So that was also part of the motivation on premium seats.
We've been talking a great deal about economics and business of Off-Broadway, but I want to come back to certainly what has been a theme through here, which is what the actual experience is in those theaters. What are people getting? And as producers, what is the kind of work that you look for, or indeed maybe working on right now, that you believe is going to be successful Off-Broadway work? Ken, you've actually developed shows, you've originated shows. It's not about finding, that there's a script and you put together a team. What's next in your stable?
Well, I'll tell you, to go back to how we started with the Blue Mans and these types of more unique theatrical experiences, which tend to find an easier way in off-Broadway, is I'm developing something that is exactly that. I optioned the rights to a website called My First Time, which is exactly what you think it's about. It's anonymous submissions by people from all over the world telling about their first sexual experience. And the amazing thing is these stories range from teenagers to people in their 50s, heterosexual, homosexual, rape, absurd, comic, everything you can imagine. And this website was started by 2 documentary filmmakers who wanted to do a film about it. And it exploded overnight, and a book was done and a series. And now I'm taking all of this stuff and adapting it into a 4-person, 2 men, 2 women, vagina monologues-esque evening where these people are telling these real life and true stories.
Marc, you mentioned, I believe, your next show.
My next show is a show called Mayumina, which is in the genre of Stomp and Blue Man. It's a nonverbal performance piece that actually comes from Israel. And, it's a terrific, it's very different than these other shows, but it still shares that nonverbal performance quality. And you know, and I didn't go looking for the next stomp. I mean, that's the funny thing, is that I think over our careers, Nancy and I certainly, and Alan, and probably even Ken, you know, have been offered the next Little Shop. So many people tell us this is the next Little Shop or the next stomp. When the very first show that my partners produced was Penn and Teller, and we got offered magic shows for years and years and years, and had no interest in, you know, magic was actually called the M word when we produced that show. We would never use the word magic to describe it. So, but anyway, you know, I'm excited about this because it found me, and I think it's, you know, it's a wonderful new show, you know, for Off-Broadway, and I think it'll
why
work.
is it an off-Broadway show as opposed to a Broadway show?
Well, we certainly contemplated, you know, whether Broadway would be hospitable. I think that because this is a show that you can't really describe, you know, it's like one of the things when we struggle with the words to describe this show, My Humana, it's how does it relate to Stomp, how does it relate to Blue Man, these other shows, and that's never a way you really want to describe a show. So I think that by definition it has to be discovered by the audience, and Off-Broadway is a better place to discover shows, because Broadway, you put it up there and it's either a hit or you just cannot sustain the economics for very long before it has to close. I mean, you know, Off-Broadway, the reason a show can take 6 months or a year to find an audience is that if the running costs are $60,000 or $80,000 a week, which unfortunately is what, you know, these shows are, you know, sort of best case probably, then, you know, you can lose a certain amount of money every week as that show finds its audience. On Broadway, you know, if you lose $100,000 a week, after 10 weeks you've lost $1 million, and so you just cannot do, you know, you can't sustain that. So therefore, discovery is possible off Broadway, and it's not on Broadway.
Nancy?
This is the Groove Lily show called Striking 12. It's something about every 3 or 4 years I hear something or hear about something. Bat Boy in 2000, and I came across Striking 12 about 3 years ago when it was in the National Alliance Musical Theater festival, which is an insider buyer's market festival that's every fall in New York. And I said, this needs a wider audience. So I have an incredible passion about the band, about this show. They're going to be fabulous musical theater. They already are fabulous musical theater writers. They have 2 new musicals they're going to be writing. They perform and act, and thanks to Sweeney Todd, that's now not unusual. That's now standard for music. That's like accepted in the musical theater because John Doyle's wonderful work. And there, I think it's going to have huge life across the country, and the world needs to see it. So when I produce, it's out of passion.
Alan, new projects?
I'm developing a couple projects, but I'm a landlord first and a producer only out of passion, as Nancy says. I have to fall in love with a piece of material. If I'm going to spend 2 years of my life developing something, it's not an intellectual decision. It's a decision that I fall in love with the material. I'm willing to spend the time and emotion and money developing material. I'm looking at a couple things. I have a piece under option called Dark Deceptions, which is a seance show, and it's a debunking of seance, because I think that we need to get away from the non-scientific, spiritualistic, motivated world that people are trying to push themselves into, and start looking towards things that are real. So I'm going to play both sides of the fence with this show.
And let me ask you, since you say you're first a landlord, you're someone that these people probably do come to and talk about whether or not they might want to have their shows in one of your theaters. Or you might be going to them and saying, you know, I'd like to have your show in one of my theaters. What kind of criteria are you looking at when deciding what's going to get on your stages?
Well, give me 2 shows from which to choose, and I'll make an aesthetic judgment. Give me 1 show, and I'll make a financial judgment. Give me 3 shows, I'll make an aesthetic and artistic choice. It all depends on what's in the marketplace. I have to fill my theaters. I have responsibilities to investors. So sometimes I can make choices, and sometimes I can't. What do I look for? I look for things that are edgier, that satisfy my desires to have people see something they haven't seen before. And my success over the years has been finding those shows, like Little Shop at the time, like a number of shows that Marc and I have done together, including Stomp. You know, Stomp is so mainstream now, people forget how edgy it was when we did it 13 years ago. So I look for that kind of material, and I look for good writing, good conception. You know, it's a subjective judgment. But at the end of the day, I got to fill the spaces, and so if there's a show out there that maybe it'll run for 6 months, and it's not my favorite piece of material, I'll probably take it. But if that's put up against something that's a little greater risk and has the potential, I think, to satisfy me, I'll go for that.
As we wrap up, I want to ask very quickly, quick answers from each of you. We talked about the pendulum is perhaps swinging back. What are the signs that we look for real health off-Broadway in the commercial theater?
The theaters being full and good shows in them.
For me, it's a sign that shows are starting to achieve more of a economic profitability, viability, and able to sustain themselves for a longer period of time.
I think it's. I think the internet finding Off-Broadway in a way that's just beginning to touch is huge, because they think that that's how people are going to look for things. That's how we find things in the world today.
Well, the purest sign of success off-Broadway is full theaters. So I concur with Marc. That's the first sign, when everything's full and shows are running.
Has that ever happened?
Sure. It has happened. It is a microsecond.
Okay. Nanosecond, right.
So it goes away. But you know, what really happens is when you have a lot of long-running shows that take occupancy in a lot of theaters, and then there are only a couple theaters available, and then best of all possible worlds, some of the shows that come into those theaters are hits. And that's what causes backup contracts and shows waiting in the wings for off-Broadway theaters.
Alan's measure of success is a lot of backup contracts.
And our measure is having the theater price reduced because there's not enough product.
Well, you can have your cake and eat it too.
On that note, we need to wrap up. Thank you all for your insights about Off-Broadway. These programs are brought to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York with our partners, CUNY TV. For everyone at the American Theater Wing, thanks for joining us.